Hello, and welcome to the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. My name is Phil Schiavone with the Coalition for Christian Outreach, campus ministry where we're transforming college students to transform the world. And with me today from Hearts and Minds Bookstore in Dallastown, Pennsylvania, the host with the most to say about the books you should be reading, Byron Borger. Byron, how are you doing today?
Well, Phil, I'm always doing well when I'm talking to you. You are so enthusiastic, and I just so appreciate you. You're one of my favorite people, and that you love books as much as you do and use them in ministry is just a real neat thing. So thank you for working with the CCO, for being a director that helps shape some of our staff in the field. If any of the CCO people are listening in, everybody knows Phil, but those that don't know, Phil is an area director for the CCO, which is this campus ministry organization where got some affiliations with, and we love what Phil does and we love what the CCO does. The last podcast, we talked a bit with Sam, your colleague Sam, about the Jubilee and the kind of books at Jubilee and why relationship books are particularly important for young adults, even though we hold out this Jubilee vision of the Lordship of Christ around every sphere of life and an integral vision, a seamless vision of vocation and calling and relating Sunday and Monday, that holistic kind of in the world vision of the restoration of all things that encourages students to take the life of the mind seriously. But yet at the end of the day, many 19, 20-year-olds at Jubilee gravitate to the part of the book display that we do there around books on relationships and self-help sort of stuff. They've got a lot of griefs and concerns and frustrations about their own personal lives. And so despite the cosmic vision of Jubilee, the restoration of all things, and that big hope, they still need some books on basic Christian living and some relational stuff. And I offered a couple of books that are on relationships. So that's what we did last time. And it was fun talking about a couple of books that we sold at Jubilee last month.
It's a wonderful episode, and it's in one sense, it's not surprising at all that that's what college students are interested in, right?
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
there's so much exploring of our relationships with each other, and then even our own selves, and then of course with our faith. And as is probably stereotypical, especially if you've spent any time in the church, you know that a lot of people's relationship with religion, with Christianity, with faith often is centered around the holiday that's coming up next, which is Easter. A lot of people, it might be the one or two times a year that they come to church to worship or to be with family. For whatever reason, it's often Christmas and Easter. And today, Byron, you've got three books on Easter for us. So why don't you dive right into our first book?
I'll tell you what, as we're recording this, we're still thick in the middle of Lent. And even as you're listening to this, it's not quite Easter yet. We're not at Holy Week quite yet. But go back and look at the book notes I've done about Lenten reads. I've done 2 book notes on that, or listen to the podcast from a couple of weeks back when we highlighted some resources for your Lenten journey. It is still this time of the church year when we sort of enter into the hardships of the way Jesus led to Jerusalem. But we do want to think about Easter coming up. And if you're a book buyer, you'll want to think about now ordering some books for the Easter season. I'm going to tell you about 3, but the first one isn't even about Easter as such. It's about the whole entire church calendar, but there's a great chapter on Easter in here. So this is the one I'm going to start with. It's brand new. It's called A Strange and Gracious Light. It's by Andrew Arndt. I've read 2 other books by Andrew Arndt, one on the church fathers, actually, one on the Holy Spirit. He's an independent pastor. He has a set of house churches. He's the most fascinating guy, one of the most fascinating preachers I know out in the Denver area, because he integrates both the liturgical kind of experience of high church. He has house church experiences. They're interested in social justice concerns. They're sort of contemplative, like the church fathers, the desert fathers. So he brings together these different streams, just a fascinating guy. And this brand new book is about how the subtitle is How the Story of Jesus Changes the Way We See Everything. So it is about Jesus and about the transforming power of Jesus to unlock a whole new vision of understanding how we see the world. It is right up our Jubilee line. But the way he gets at this, Phil, get this. I mean, to get at how we understand Jesus and the life of Jesus and how that transforms everything is by way of the church calendar. And so he uses a sort of a methodological style, a genre to get into this topic of who Jesus is. just by looking at the church calendar. So he walks you through the whole liturgical cycle of Advent and Christmas and Epiphany and Lent. The Lent chapter is very good. It's called The Weakness, the Power, and the Power of Weakness. And then Good Friday, Safe with Jesus, is a great chapter. And then there's an Easter chapter called The Future That Does Not Depend on Us. So the Good Friday chapter and the Easter chapter in this brand new book are the only ones I've read so far, but it's really good. Let me just kind of highlight what he's doing here and how to be transformed by this light of the gospel that gleams among us. He says here in the beginning of the book, and he says, it's troubling that in my conversations with people as a pastor, more often than not, I find our sense of the gospel is not too much, but too little, that it has become narrow and limited, constricting, small. It leaves far too much out. For we have been taught to think of the gospel as mere instructions on how to get to heaven, or to be presented to our unbelieving neighbors or to the listening congregation at the end of church with a sermon to repent and believe. He says, I've lived with the gospel for all my life now, and I'm sure that it is not less than that. But I'm likewise convinced that it is something that is more, much more, and that something more is intensely powerful. And so then he asks, well, what is the gospel then? And he says, the best definition I know of comes from the late theologian Robert Jensen, who argued that the gospel is, quite simply, and this is a quote, the story of Jesus told as a promise. I like that. The story of Jesus told as a promise. The whole story of Jesus. He says not just a couple bits and pieces, the death and resurrection, for example, but the whole kit and caboodle, from the long period of preparation to the incarnation, to the miracles and signs through the death and resurrection and the ascension of the Messiah, the sending of the Spirit at Pentecost, all the way to the coming of the new heavens and the new earth and a new creation. That is the gospel. The story of Jesus told as a promise. Well, if that's true, that the gospel is a story, and it's a story of a promise of a new restoration. Again, this sounds a lot like our Jubilee Conference language of creation, fall, redemption, restoration. If that's what the gospel is, then how do you understand how it transfigures everything we do? He says, well, let's just look at 1 year in the life of Jesus and how the church has historically celebrated the church year. And so this book is on the church calendar, using the church calendar as a way to show how through ritual and liturgy and faith and worship, the community of God's people historically have understood the life of Jesus. Because the church calendar, of course, follows the life of Jesus. And we do that year after year after year, immersing ourselves in that story. So this is a brand new book. It just came. All I've read is the Easter chapter so far, but it's a great chapter to get us ready for Easter and to put the Easter story in the broader context of the whole promise of God, of the fulfillment of his initial promises to restore the creation. I'm excited by this, Andrew. I like the book.
Well, it sounds great. I'm a storyteller at heart myself, and that's part of why I love this recommendation here is that for half my life, the first half of my life, Easter was sort of disembodied from the rest of my faith, right? Like it was just this holiday. It was great. It was inspirational, but I didn't know how the Easter story connected with the rest of the Bible. I didn't know how the Easter story connected with the rest of the calendar. And even as I've admitted in other episodes too, I only long to be a little bit more liturgical in my life because most of my life is unorganized. Most of my life is just kind of flowing with the Spirit, if you will. And so to have something that relates this to the rest of the calendar and to the rest of the story and to the rest of our story, right? This universal story, this universal scope of what we're getting at, really intriguing, especially centered through the calendar. And of course, anyone that knows me too is that I'm a huge fan of the book of Genesis and Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And just knowing that there's so little actually in that first chapter of the Bible, but knowing that it mattered for God to ordain the seasons through the stars, right? That we would have these seasons and the seasons themselves would tell the story of God and his goodness. It's so important for us to try and tune into how Easter not only is part of that, but fits in the greater part of that as well.
Nice. Well put, Phil. Hey, just so you know, the foreword to this brand new book is by Marilyn McEntyre, who's written some wonderful poetry, some devotionals. She has a book called Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies that I adore, about writing. She's a peacemaker. She's a poet. She's a medical ethicist, actually, and a literature prof. So she does a lot. And when she writes a foreword to a book, that's pretty exceptional. She talks about meeting him in a writing program. And the first thing she noticed about this author, she says, is what a good listener he was, that he was paying attention. You could almost see him connecting the dots. And then when he asked a question, you knew it was profound because he had heard well what other people had shared. So he's a great storyteller. But for him, storytelling begins in the act of listening well. At least that's what Marilyn says in the preface. So that's one great book to get us in the mood of thinking about the liturgical calendar. The next one I want to tell you about really is Easter. Easter par excellence. It is a slim little book. Everybody should buy it. Everybody should buy more than one to give away. It's in this series called The Fullness of Time that our friend Esau McCaulley edited. He did this little thin series of compact hardbacks. I've talked about them often in our podcast here, the Fullness of Time series, they call it, and they're on the liturgical calendar. Not exactly a devotional, but nice kind of historical background on what the text means and why we celebrate the thing we do, whether it's Pentecost or Lent or Advent or Christmas. And this is the second to last one in the series. There'll be one coming next year, but this is the big one we've been waiting for. It's on Easter and the Easter Tide series. It's interesting. He says it's some Christians are so fastidious about caring for Lent for 40 days, giving something up and so forth. And then they forget about Easter after one day, when Easter in the historic church calendar is 50 days till you get to Pentecost. And so it includes Ascension Day, the resurrection of Jesus to the right hand of the Father. I mean, there's a lot going on here after Easter, but it's certainly largely about Easter. He looks at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John at the four accounts of Easter. They're a little different, as you know, and he wonders why that is, and he explains some of the uniquenesses of each of the synoptic Gospels and John in telling the story of Jesus. This book by Wesley Hill is just beautiful. Now, he's an Anglican, of course, didn't used to be, but he talks about being a student in England, and he's there in Durham going early in the morning in the dark to read the texts as they do at the Easter Vigil. You read the text in the dark, and then you go outside, and there's a fire, and the light begins, and the beaming sunrise happens, and you're reading the Gospels, and then the party begins, and people have a hoot and a holler. They really celebrate and sometimes bring out instruments and stuff. They have a blast, almost incorporating bodily this new creation energy that breaks forth from the tomb and raises Jesus from the dead. So you start in the dark, you have a little fire, the sun comes up, and everything becomes a joy. The bishop leading that service, shouting out that Christ is risen, happened to be N.T. Wright as he tells the story. And as he's opening this book with this story of his first major Easter vigil, and the little country church, and the dark, and the fire, and the light, and the sunrise, man, I wanted to be there. I got choked up reading this account of a worship service. And that just maybe just says to me how some of us are just longing for an embodied celebration that's more than just, a typical little church service, but a liturgical service that is embodied and sensual and full of color and sound and feeling and smells, and then food and party, and then 50 days of celebration. Man, what a little book this is. He is risen indeed. And this is the best little summary of why the liturgical church makes such a big deal out of Easter, more so than some Protestants do, who just celebrate it for a day and then go eat some ham. This is like the real deal. And so I'm excited about Wesley Hill. He teaches at Western Theological Seminary, which is an RCA denominational affiliated seminary in Holland, Michigan. He lived in Pittsburgh for a while and has spoken at Jubilee and has been friends of the Bookstore and of CCO over the years. He's written some other things. His last book was on the Lord's Prayer, actually. And he ends a little of this book with a little section about things you do as resurrection people. And one of them is pray. And there's a little section of prayer at the end of this, too. So it's 5 or 6 chapters, including the Ascension. And I'm thrilled with this whole series. And I'm glad for the one on Easter, and I'm glad Wes Hill did it. So this is pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's great. I got the thrill of being in a small conference with Wes Hill once. And he's the type of guy that if you ever do get the chance to hear him, it just colors how I read him now too. He's so mild-mannered and happy. and like he's got this like joy about his personality. And then to hear how you painted how he illustrates that Easter morning service, it just had me smiling behind the camera here of like, oh man, that does sound great. And it brought me back to my own Anabaptist roots where we would celebrate with sunrise services every Easter morning, and how I drag myself up and then always be so glad that I got up in the morning, even if I was tired the rest of the holiday, and even with through the Easter ham. It was always great to know, like, oh yeah, there's something about our own bodies that need to kind of experience that transition from darkness to light to get just a fuller sense of what is going on with Easter.
Well, I've been to some sunrise services, and I preached at sunrise services, and I've enjoyed them. But, the way he describes this more Anglican experience, and I know some Lutherans do this, the Orthodox do this, where you do it at night and you're reading texts, literally the promises of God through the Old Testament, long, starting with, Genesis, and starting with, Noah and Babel, and going through the covenant and Abraham. You did this whole history of redemption in the dark. And then as you get to this climax of the promise being fulfilled, then light breaks out. And then they bring instruments and they play and they goof around and they do all kind of celebration. I've never been to a service like that. I have a friend, I have an acquaintance, a loved one, I won't tell you who it is, but a loved one who had a young friend who is an atheist and never been to church, and said through this friendship, thought she may want to become a Christian like her friend was. And her friend said, I don't want to tell you about the gospel. Just come to this vigil service, hear half the Old Testament read out loud, and then celebrate Jesus, and then we'll talk. And so the young seeker went with my daughter to an Easter vigil service. They hold half the Old Testament read out loud in the dark, and then the resurrection of Jesus, fulfilling the whole story, and the light came on for our friend. It's like she accepted Christ and became a Christian then, in the context of this resurrection service that starts in the dark and tells the promises of God and unfolds the drama until you finally get to the high point of it all. And she said that's the best way to sort of present the gospel of somebody, to put it in the whole big context of the whole biblical story, and then celebrate to the max. And so who wouldn't want to become a Christian if that's your exposure to the gospel for the first time ever? The story with a promise, like that first author said, the story is a promise. So this little Easter book by Wes Hill is a gem of a book, and I highly recommend it.
That's great. Well, your final book here is perhaps the author me and my friends discuss the most through his podcasts and books. So why don't you give us our third and final book for our podcast today?
Well, the last one that I chose, and there's so much on Easter and so much on Holy Saturday and Jesus descending to the dead. What does that mean? What the heck goes on in the harrowing of hell, as they put it? There's books on the 7 last words of Christ, if you're interested in Good Friday. But when you move towards Easter, man, there just isn't that many really, really thoughtful books out there. It's interesting. And this is one of my favorites. It is by the late, great Timothy Keller. Keller, of course, was raised in a moderate, fairly boring mainline church, and had a living encounter with Jesus when he was a college student at Bucknell, got involved in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and eventually became a PCA pastor, pastored in a small church in Virginia for a while, and ended up doing a church plant in the highly secularized Manhattan area of New York City. New York City is considerably different now than it was then, but it was hard for anybody to even imagine an evangelical church plant in the city in those days. And he had fairly classic music, fairly traditional liturgy, nothing too highbrow, but it wasn't a rock and contemporary service with an auditorium and smoke and mirrors. It was just him preaching. And Keller was known as a communicator, as an apologist, people making a case for those that were seekers or those that were skeptics. And he always used the baptized imagination, as C.S. Lewis would put it, his baptized imagination and his mind, heart and mind, to proclaim the gospel in New York. And Redeemer Presbyterian has been an important church for many of us. May not agree with everything they do, but it's been a real model. Near the end of his life, it was his second bout with cancer. He had thyroid cancer first, and he lived through that. And then he got pancreatic cancer. And as he was dying, COVID was hitting as well. And everybody was scared. People were a mess. Things were closing down as they needed to, the quarantines and so forth. How many people were dying, particularly in New York City. People were just dying and dying and dying. It was a hard time. We forget how awful it was. And Tim had cancer and didn't know if he was going to make it. And so he wrote a book about where you find hope in times of fear. And the book is called Hope in Times of Fear. But the subtitle is this: The Resurrection and the Meaning of Easter. I believe this is the last book, official book that he actually wrote. A book came out after this on forgiveness, but I'm not sure he wrote that. I think he maybe had written much of that before this. I believe, I'm not positive, but I believe this is the last work he did as he was dying of cancer in the midst of a terribly horrific time of fear and anxiety in America, in the world because of the pandemic. And where do you find hope in the middle of that? So this is a book making a case that if Jesus rose from the dead, and that is a promise for the restoration of creation, that his resurrected body is the first fruits of a resurrected creation. If a new creation is a coming, if a new world is being born, if we get to be a part of that, God's redemptive, holistic work in the world, then we do indeed have solid, historically foundational reasons to have hope. So this is both an inspirational, pastoral call to find hope in the midst of hard times, to find security if you're scared, even of things like your own personal death, and a call to be people of social goodness, social righteousness, justice and peace and beauty and love in the world, even as it's falling apart around us. So there's a lot going on in this book. It is about the historical resurrection of Jesus and why the bodily claims of his resurrection can be shown through the eyewitness accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's a historical argument for the validity of the resurrection, but more so, it's about all that implies, all that means, how we find hope, how we find security in the midst of difficult times of disease and death and the loss of a vision for the shared common good even. We don't even kind of have a common vision anymore with the polarization that's set in. And that was beginning to happen even as he was writing this book in the early Trump years, for instance, when things were really getting polarized. So you just think back to those years as the beginning polarization was setting in, and you got that going on as well. So there's a whole lot of social context. He addresses it wisely, thoughtfully, graciously. And at the end of the day, he's pushing a gospel of hope because Jesus rose from the dead. So this really is about the power of Easter, the meaning of Easter, the joy of Easter, and the hope of a paradise yet to come because Jesus literally rose from the dead. And what that can mean for us, even as we face our own mortality and our own social dislocation and disorientation that we face in difficult times, difficult cultural times. So I'm a big fan of Keller. I so am grateful for the times we've met, for the times he asked us to sell books up there, for the opportunities we had to minister with them up there at Redeemer from time to time. And I'm really glad, even as he was sick, that he wrote this book on hope in the midst of fear.
Yeah, and that's just wonderful context that you gave us there about his personal life and, of course, our social lives together around that, and to hear a fresh take from Keller on what that meant to him, as well as just knowing and trusting the depth and the breadth of Keller's own knowledge of the Bible, as well as his ability to communicate it. That
Yeah,
sounds like the makings of a fantastic book there, and one that I'm already
yeah,
like, I could see myself connecting to that in some of the places where I need hope. And that's a good reminder,
yeah,
too, that Easter has not only this cosmic hope for salvation, right, with the first fruits of resurrection and all of that, but it also was meant as a personal connection to our own need for resurrection and our own need to have hope in times of fear. So you set that up just so well, Byron. Thanks so much.
Well, let me read you the table of contents because this literally kind of tells you the stuff he's talking about. The first chapter is a certain hope, and then a future hope, a glorious hope, a subversive hope. That's a powerful chapter. He has something called the Great Reversal. And then he has Personal Hope 1 and Personal Hope 2. So there's two chapters on the very personal side of this. And then the 8th chapter is Hope for You, then Hope for Relationships, Hope for Justice, Hope in the face of suffering, and Hope for the future. So he's covering his bases here, man. It is a beautiful proclamation of the full implications of the whole gospel. And you could give this book to any believer And I will tell you what, they will find things in here that they probably never thought about and that they never quite heard put this way in their ordinary church. It's just that wise and that jam-packed. Not that other preachers aren't saying this stuff, but it really says it well. And I'm convinced that many Christians will go like, wow, I never thought of that. You could also give this book to seekers, to skeptics, to people that deny the resurrection or don't care or just show up at church on Easter Sunday because that's what you're supposed to do. And they don't really have any good argument for it or understanding of it. And this book could be apologetics in that sense, that you could give this book to somebody and they would come away with one of the most profound understandings of the kingdom of God and the power of hope in our lives, both personally and publicly, that you're ever going to find. So I'm a big fan of this book. Highlight it here and recommend it to people. It's 20% off at our newsletter, in our store through this podcast. So if you're listening in, come on, let's get some of these books and get them spread around, because this is the best time of year to talk about the gospel here in the heels of Lent and the beginning of Easter and Eastertide. We got a good season here to talk about this important stuff.
Amen. Well, exactly. Yeah. The first link that you'll see in the description of this episode will be a link to order these books. And just as Timothy Keller and this book can relate to any person in their Christian walk and any part of their walk, Byron and Hearts and Minds as well, like for other topics that we haven't talked about here in our Easter episode. If there aren't even books that you don't even know yet, right? But you have a particular topic or question in mind, call up Byron, call up Hearts and Minds and ask them what books they have on the topic where you're at in your own faith. And you can do that through the order form as well. We thank you so much for listening to this episode of 3 Books from Hearts and Minds. Please do check out that order form at the top of the show description, and tune in again for another episode of the 3 Books from Hearts and Minds podcast.